Economist in Ethiopia, and he specializes in utility rates and resource analysis.
It's great to be here. I'm going to talk briefly, and hopefully we can get on to our panel discussion in a very short time. I think you've heard enough of the characteristics of a carbon tax. The one point that I will make about a carbon tax or any other carbon pricing scheme, cap and auction, cap and dividend, is that you have localized disparities. Different regions, different consumers have very different carbon dependency. A true cap and trade system, as we did with sulfur dioxide, with free allowances given to emitters and ramped down over time, can address those regional disparities. But one of the penalties, one of the problems of any kind of carbon pricing is that the carbon disparities that result from historic patterns of energy development are gnarly issues. Price elasticity alone, which is what a carbon tax depends on for carbon reduction, is a pretty blunt instrument. The Carbon Tax Center has I'll call it their homepage scenario, that predicts a $262 per ton tax on carbon, on C, would result in about a 50% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions by 2035. That's a big carbon tax. That's what it takes to do it with price elasticity alone, and you'll see an example of how that works in just a minute. I've decided instead to talk about $100 a ton carbon tax. Why $100 a ton? Well, it takes $30 to $60 a ton to get coal to shift to gas. It takes $80 to $120 a ton or so to get gas to shift to renewables. That is, to make wind, solar, and geothermal cost competitive without tax breaks or subsidies for either industry with natural gas generation at current and forecast gas prices. So what would $100 a ton carbon tax mean? About a 44% increase in Puget Sound energy rates, almost no increase in Seattle City Light rates. They have a very clean portfolio. About a 40% increase in natural gas rates. But the important one here really is petroleum. It would mean about a 25% increase in gasoline prices, but only about a 9% increase in the total cost of driving, because a lot of the cost of driving is the car, and the insurance, and the parking place, which aren't subject to the carbon tax so directly. So we would expect as economists to see about a 7% reduction in gasoline usage from a $100 a ton carbon tax, but only a 2% reduction in driving. That is, a carbon tax of this magnitude will cause people to give up their Hummers and buy Priuses, but it won't get them to give up their Priuses and move into a condo in town where they can walk to work. And that's important to realize, that even a $100 a ton carbon tax was going to have the kind of modest impacts that aren't going to get us to an 80% reduction by 2050. Now, my main topic is electricity. CO2 emissions vary greatly by utility. The public power utilities in Washington State have historically built hydroelectric projects themselves and have access to the Vaudeville Power Administration's hydro. The private utilities get more of their power from natural gas and coal. Pacific Power, which serves Yakima and Walla Walla, about 2/3 coal in their portfolio, has the highest carbon profile of any utility in the state. Our state as a whole is better than average. Washington and Oregon are far better than average. When you look at the entire Northwest, though, if you include Montana and Utah, sort of the region that's called the Northwest Power Pool, and Idaho, you wind up with something that's much dirtier. We're winners, but the Northwest as a whole is not too far off of average. But a $100 a ton carbon tax, here I've shown each utility's rates and what $100 a ton would do, based on 2009 actual revenues for each utility, would more than double electric rates in Yakima and Walla Walla. think those senators and representatives and you're going to be too enthusiastic about that. Pretty hefty increase in Puget Sound energy rates and very small increases to the rates of the public power utility. This is the regional disparity that I'm talking about. Some industries within the state could be pretty heavily affected. And I put on the left side of the screen the most energy-intensive industries. There shouldn't be too many surprises there. Those that have more than 5% of their cost structure in energy. On the right, the least energy-intensive, and the one I'm going to call out is aircraft manufacturing. There's only about $150,000 worth of aluminum and $150 million 777. So doubling the cost of aluminum with a big carbon tax would add about $150,000 or 0.1% to the cost of a 777. Most of our employment is in the least energy intensive sectors, except one that happens to be both important and powerful: agriculture and food processing. There's not only regional geographic disparities, but also industry to industry disparities. There are some gnarly issues that have to be dealt with. Imported electricity. Puget Sound Energy gets about 1/3 of its electricity from coal plants in Montana. Who taxes the carbon? Does Montana get to do that, or do we get to do that? Or both? Certainly a lot of fear is that both will happen. BC Hydro buys a lot of coal-fired power from Alberta. They send a lot of power to California. The Californians believe they're buying hydropower. Who has responsibility for the coal that's burned in Alberta? The California approach is to actually address this, is to make the entity delivering power into the state of California, either a generating plant or a transmission line, responsible for the carbon that's in that electricity. But finding it isn't easy. When Alberta sells coal power to BC and BC sells power to a marketer in Washington, which sells power to a broker in Oregon, which sells power to a broker in California, which sells power to 14 utilities in California, it gets to be very hard to track. It's easy to do it at the source. It's more difficult to do it once it's left the power plant. Exported petroleum products are also a gnarly issue. The Washington oil refineries provide most of Oregon's refined petroleum products. Oregon, if we tax that carbon, it may cause Oregon to choose to import from Alaska or other refineries. Most of eastern Washington's petroleum comes from refineries out of state. The BC approach is to tax what's consumed in the province. Works, but it's a gnarly issue with imports and exports. I put this up, we're going to talk about this later this afternoon. Public support for the BC carbon tax when the price of gasoline went up in 2008. Voter support for the carbon tax went down. And of course the price of gas has now gone back up again, so we'll see what the polls say. I look forward to that discussion this afternoon. Fortunately, there is an answer to all of this, and that is a moderate carbon tax that gets invested in carbon reductions. This is the McKinsey curve. Many of you have seen it. It's a whole bunch of energy efficiency and renewable energy measures, beginning with lighting and housing retrofits and industrial motors and hybrid cars, agricultural product improvements. We eventually get into solar and coal carbon capture and sequestration. The point is that at about $30 a ton, we can get pretty much all the carbon reductions that we need. A $30 a ton carbon tax invested in carbon reduction can get us the carbon reductions we need, but a $100 a ton carbon tax just left out there in the marketplace may not. So I'll quit there, take a couple of questions on this presentation, and then we'll bring the whole panel together. But if you've got a question that's more general, wait for all of us to get up here.